Mabuhay! Welcome to Lagim, a Filipino True Crime Podcast. My name is Christine, and this is episode 13 on the murder of Nida Blanca. As always, make sure to follow Lagim on all its socials. We are on Instagram at Lagim Podcast, on Twitter at Lagim Pod, on TikTok at Lagim Podcast, and on Facebook. Just search for Lagim, a Filipino True Crime Podcast, and find both our fan page and our discussion group there. Lagim is also officially on YouTube now, so you can stream all the past episodes and this one right now. So make sure that you subscribe to our channel. Content warning. This episode contains details that could be upsetting and disturbing to some people. So make sure that you take care of yourself whilst listening. I have received so many messages and comments about this case, and I have to say that initially I felt hesitant covering such a well-known case because I think in a way a lot of the things that had to be said about the case may have been said already in not only other true crime podcasts but also on YouTube, especially on YouTube. But what kind of podcast host will I be if I did not give in to listener suggestions at some point? So here we go. Nida Blanca, someone who would become a pillar in Filipino show business, was born Dorothy Ginto Jones on the 6th of January 1936 in Gapan, Nueva Ecija, when the Philippines was still a Commonwealth country of the United States. Her father was an American soldier who was actually a mestizo named Jose Zobel Acuesa, and her mother was a local girl named Inocencia Velez Ginto. Nida got her first break in film when she was only 15, but she was not exactly foreign to the performing arts at that point. When she was merely 13 years old, she won an amateur singing contest in Manila. So by the time she appeared in her first film, I can safely assume that Nida had caught the performance bug, and she may have felt like this was her life's calling. Nevertheless, she almost actually did not make it to showbiz. She took up a pre-law degree at the University of Santo Tomas, or UST. But I guess even at that age, the call of the performing arts was way too loud and hard to ignore. So Nida followed that call. Nida Blanca, her official screen name, came about when another actress, Delia Razon, named her so. I do not think there is a special explanation as to the name Nida, but we do know that Delia insisted on the name Blanca because of Nida's fair complexion. After all, Blanca is Spanish for white. And I think even Delia then knew that even without the screen name, that moment was the moment that a star was born. After her first appearance in a movie, Nida's rise was swift, and she became a movie royalty pretty quickly. She would go on to star in many films. She often starred in comedies with fellow thespian and dance partner Nestor de Villa, who was in almost 50 movies with her. She played a diverse set of characters in her around 200 movies. In the early days of her career, she would commonly play a tomboyish character, sometimes wielding a knife, but nevertheless charming and lovable. She was versatile as well. She could play a screwball character in one movie and then portray a character so convincingly in a dramatic movie the next time around. Nida won around 16 awards for her work in film, which goes to show that her talents were respected and recognized within the industry. Nida also branched out into television, and she can be remembered starring prominently in a show called John and Marcia, opposite the king of comedy, Dolphy. Even I remember the reruns of this show when I was a young kid who just moved from Germany to Davao. I bet if you asked your mom or Lola, they will remember Nida Blanca in other shows such as Mana Mana or even the Nida Nestor show, where she reunited with her dance partner and acting partner, Nestor de Villa. I also vaguely remember another show, and I know I must have been only 8 or 7 at that time, but does anybody remember 50 Carats o Diba? Well, in that show, she was with some other very highly regarded showbiz royalties, such as Gloria Romero and Charito Solis. I could go on and on pointing out the illustrious 6-decade career of Nida Blanca, but really what it all shows is that she was a veteran. She was the ultimate professional. She was an institution, but she was also a normal person like the rest of us. She was a mother and a wife. Nida was married twice. Her first marriage was to Victorino Torres. Their marriage produced Nida's only child, Kay. However, the marriage did not last long. When Kay was merely 2 years old, married life became burdensome, and the couple decided to separate, not divorce. As you know, divorce is not legal and available in the Philippines. And I know this is something of a remnant from our colonial past and a result of the huge influence of the Catholic Church on legislation or maybe the government, but anyway, that is perhaps another interesting conversation for some other time. As for Nida, she would eventually meet someone new and fall in love again. In 1979, Nida would marry American singer and actor Rod Lauren, or better known to the Filipinos for his real name, Roger Lawrence Strunk, or just Rod Strunk. It seems implied in a lot of reports that after the wedding, the family spent most of their time in the United States, but eventually relocated to Manila. I could not find any reliable and definitive sources to confirm that information, so please bear that in mind. Nida Blanca was one of those old school Filipino showbiz personalities, the types who are so private about their personal lives and just let their work speak for themselves. I do not think I remember ever hearing or seeing her involved in any major attention grabbing showbiz gossip or perhaps tabloid headlines. So it was all the more shocking when on the 7th of November 2001, reports emerged that Nida was found dead in the backseat of her car on the 6th floor parking lot of the Atlanta Center in San Juan, Manila. So, what happened to Nida Blanca? Let us go back to the last time anyone has seen Nida Blanca alive. In making this episode, I happened upon a very helpful true crime blogger who wrote about the case in a very concise manner, and I will be referencing them a lot in the first half of this episode. The blog is called Prime Crime, and the writer is Isa Baksa. I will make sure to include a link to her article on this case in the sources list on Lagim's website and blog, so make sure you check that out. Anyway, back to Nida. People might not necessarily have known this about Nida, but in the years leading up to her death, she had become more and more active behind the camera, in a way. She worked with the Movie and Television and Review Classification Board, better known as the MTRCB, which is essentially the entity that rates movies and television shows. The people who give movies the R18 rating or the PG-13 rating, that kind of stuff. Nida was a big believer in classifying movies and TV shows correctly, rather than censoring them so strictly. Essentially, she believed that freedom of expression is so important in the growth of the film industry in a largely Catholic country such as the Philippines. Her perspective as an actress and as an artist would have been very valuable to the MTRCB. So, on the 6th of November 2001, Nida headed to San Juan to the office of the MTRCB to join a meeting and a film review as a board member. The office was located on the 33rd floor of the Atlanta Center in Greenhills. Nida would attend these meetings and screenings in Greenhills at least twice a week. After that day's meeting and screening, Nida then left her office at 5 o'clock. According to the blog Prime Crime, an employee at MTRCB recounted how she saw Nida receiving a phone call and then leaving afterwards. Reports would reveal that Nida told fellow MTRCB employees that she would be attending a wake at the Santuario de San Antonio in Forbes Park, which is located in Makati. Nida was heard saying cheerfully, "See you again tomorrow," just before leaving. According to the same blog, around 10 in the evening, Nida's personal assistant, named Elena de la Paz, noticed that Nida had still not arrived at home. I guess as a personal assistant, you become so in tune with your employer's routine that when something is amiss, you become very worried, and that is exactly what happened to Elena. As a result, she reached out to Nida's friends and asked them if they knew where she was, but they had no idea. So, Elena made a move. According to the Prime Crime blog, Elena and two relatives, and by the way, we don't know if these were her relatives or relatives of Nida's, went to the Atlanta Center to look for Nida. Upon arriving and inquiring after Nida, Elena was told by the security personnel at the site that actually Nida's car was still in the building's parking space. Elena then thought that perhaps Nida had left the car behind, deliberately of course, before going out with a friend in a different vehicle. As someone who was worried and as someone who may have felt a personal responsibility for Nida's well-being and safety, I do not think Elena could and wanted to think that something bad had happened to her employer. So, as a result, she headed home at around 11:30 in the evening and informed Nida's husband, Rod Strunk, that Nida was nowhere to be found. Now, you probably have the same question, or perhaps questions at this point. Why didn't the husband go and look for his wife? A lot of the news articles I have read did not exactly indicate whether Rod Strunk had or had not gone out to look for Nida. I found one article that said he did go out to look for her around 8 p.m., which means that he was out and about before Elena, the personal assistant, left their home to head to the MTRCB office. Now, the lack of information about Strunk's movements and activities at this point, and the lack of corroboration from other people who may have known about Strunk's efforts to look for Nida, could potentially be explained by the later accusations of his involvement in this case, but we will get to that point eventually. First, let us get to know Rod a little bit more. Roger Lawrence Strunk, or Rod Strunk, was born in Fresno, California on the 20th of March, 1941. Despite being born in Fresno, his family moved to Tracy, California 2 years after, where he attended schools and discovered his love for music and plays. He would go on to star in a lot of school plays, and he also played the trombone in the school band. By 1959, he began singing in local clubs in Fresno. It was during one of those gigs that he was encouraged to audition by a recording executive, no less. After the audition, he was signed with RCA Records. Reports indicate that his singing career was a bit, low-key. He had one hit song in 1960 called If I Had a Girl, which, by the way, he managed to perform twice on the Ed Sullivan Show. That was a big deal back then. So, whilst this was all happening in his singing career, he also tried his hand at acting both in TV and in film. One could presume that he stayed within both industries as a small time singer actor, but reports would indicate that he did not have much success in either industries. As far as the internet is concerned, his name would only resurface again in the late 70s when he and Nida Blanca starred together in a movie called Once Before I Die. It was during the shoot of this movie that Nida and Rod fell in love and eventually got married in the US in 1979. So, now that we know a little bit more about Rod, let us go back to November 2001. After an unsuccessful search for Nida by her personal assistant Elena, reports indicated that the next day, a security guard was doing his rounds on the 6th floor parking lot in the Atlanta Center. Whilst doing his walk around, he found a blood trail on the floor. He followed this, and it led him to a car that was parked some few meters away from where he was standing. The car was a green Nissan Sentra. It was Nida's car. The security guard then tried to pry the car door open, but it remained locked. He then looked inside, and to his horror, he found Nida slumped in the back seat. The security guard quickly called in what he saw, and the police were at the crime scene soon enough. Nida's death could not be kept from the public for long, and news had indeed broken out very quickly. The public was shocked, and now they and Nida's friends and family wanted answers. I think at this point the police knew that they could not be caught unawares in this case. They needed to present a strong front and prioritize the case as much as possible. Even then, President Macapagal Arroyo ordered the PNP and the NBI to quickly solve the case. It has to be noted that it was Macapagal Arroyo who appointed Nida as a board member for the MTRCB. So, having said all that, the PNP, or the Philippine National Police, formed a task force merely a day after Nida had been found dead. The PNP formed Task Force Marcia to widen its probe of the killing. Obviously, the task force was named after Nida's long-running TV sitcom with Dolphy, John and Marcia, as I already mentioned earlier in the episode. When I first heard about the name of the task force, I don't think I felt too comfortable with it. It felt almost insincere to name the task force this way, but I guess that is a matter of opinion, and I'm willing to relent at this point. Anyway, in a lot of murder cases, before the police could even get their first leads, the medical examination is usually the primary source of clues and even evidence that could help propel an investigation forward. So, what did the medical examination in Nida's case exactly say? Again, be warned that some details could be upsetting. The medical examination revealed that Nida sustained 13 stab wounds to her head, ears, neck, left armpit, and left jaw. The chief medical examiner, Superintendent Edgardo Guico, would say, and I quote, "While most of the wounds were superficial, the fatal one was at her throat, with a pointed instrument coming from the left, cutting through right, and hitting the jugular vein." End of quote. Guico noted that at least 2 types of pointed weapons, probably short knives, were used in the attack because the wounds did not appear identical. Guico also noted that the wounds appeared to have been inflicted in an indiscriminate manner, indicating that the assailant or assailants attacked Nida in an angry, perhaps frenzy type of way. The autopsy also revealed that it did not look like Nida fought back, as she did not sustain any defense wounds. It was, however, noted that her ribs were broken and that she sustained a black eye. Now, the following determination of the medical examiner is what really shook me to the core for some reason. The coroners at the time estimated that Nida's time of death could have been between 4 and 5 in the morning of the 7th of November. The NBI, or the National Bureau of Investigation, also gave the same estimate as to Nida's time of death. Apparently, rigor mortis, or the stiffening of the body, had not set in completely when she was found. Her body was still soft, and her wounds seemed fresh when the coroners pulled her out of the car and examined her on site. It was suspected that after hurting her, her assailant or assailants left her to die a slow death. It seemed cruel to the core, and clearly an indication to me that her assailant or assailants wanted her to suffer immensely till the very end. As for the crime scene, it looked like nothing was missing from her belongings, and there was no sign of forced entry into the car. So robbery was eliminated as a motive for the crime. According to one report from the Philippine Star, the medical examiner's team had the presence of mind to preserve any potential DNA from the attacker or attackers that might have been left underneath Nida's fingernails. So, I guess the thinking was, despite the absence of defense wounds, Nida may have potentially still scratched her killer or killers. Her scratching the attacker would not necessarily inflict on her any defense wounds, so there is merit in the medical examiner's plan there. When I was reading this particular article by the Philippine Star, my mind started to wander to the moment when Nida was attacked. And I imagined how it was done given all the information that we had so far. And luckily, the theory of the police at that time, merely days after Nida's death, matched my theory partially. And this is how the theory of the police goes. Nida was stabbed those few meters away from her car, hence the blood trail that the security guard eventually found. The police also thought that she would have been dragged to the car and left there to die. And that is it, really. That is all the police said at that time about their theory. And I think I understand why they stopped there. It was early days in the investigation, and they still needed a lot of information in order to expound on their current theory. But this is what I think happened to Nida. She was walking towards her car when she was suddenly attacked from the back. Someone stabbed her once or twice to incapacitate her. She was then dragged to the car, leaving behind the blood trail that was later found by the security guard. And in her car, she was attacked and stabbed some more. Now, why would I say that? I say that because in some reports it was stated that the blood trail found by the security guard was described as quote-unquote discreet. So I cannot imagine that all the stab wounds were sustained outside of the car. But then again, I am not sure of the results of the examination of the car either. Was there an abundance of blood in the car perhaps? Was there a sign of struggle? Were there other trace evidence found in the car? Unfortunately, I could not find any reports that could even marginally address those questions. So I guess we have to circle back to what else we know about the crime scene and about Nida. The lack of defense wounds indicated that the attacker or attackers came from behind her, so she did not necessarily see a thing and she could not defend herself. On top of that, it looked like the parking lot where her car was parked was very dark, and aside from a wide-angle mirror, it did not have any security guard station nor surveillance cameras. So, given what they had learned in those few days of investigating Nida's killing, the police most definitely had their work cut out for them. One line of inquiry that was pursued at the beginning pointed to truants in the area. Some MTRCB employees had fallen victim to vandalism by truants, and Nida's car at some point became a casualty as well. However, this line of inquiry was quickly stopped as the evidence did not really point to truants as being Nida's killer or killers. So, despite all this, the investigation was nevertheless quickly gaining pace, and some people might think that because this was obviously a high profile case, the NBI might have wanted to take the reins and lead the investigation into Nida's killing. After all, we have seen a couple of times in this podcast already how the NBI had taken on a leading role in investigating killings of normal citizens, such as the Visconde family. My understanding is that the NBI has a specific mandate to only investigate certain types of crimes, which include extrajudicial killings, murders of judges, human trafficking cases, or corruption cases, just to name a few. But perhaps, like the FBI in the US, the NBI can only step in once a local police authority asks for their assistance in a certain investigation. In Nida's case, the NBI, however, announced on the 9th of November that they would only be involved in the investigation in a supporting role. The PNP would be leading. As for the PNP, Chief Superintendent Nestorio Gualberto, director of the PNP Criminal Investigation and Detection Group, was named head of Task Force Marcia. Whilst the police were busy following leads, Nida's family had the difficult task of dealing with this massive loss and the funeral of a beloved artist, friend, wife, and mother. Nida Blanca was laid to rest on the 14th of November, a mere week after she was discovered dead in the Atlanta Center. Nida is buried at the Loyola Memorial Park in Marikina City. So, what happened to the investigation after this? 11 days after Nida was found dead in her car, someone came forward admitting to her killing. A Pedro Philip Lucero Medel Jr., or simply Philip Medel, came forward and surrendered to the PNP. He signed a sworn statement saying that he killed Nida. Apparently, he was moved by his conscience to surrender to the authorities and to admit his wrongdoing. According to Medel, he was contacted by someone called Mike Martinez. Mr. Martinez called Medel around October 2001 and asked him to be part of a certain project called the Tantoco Project. This would involve intimidating a swindling wife of a Chinese man. According to Prime Crime, Medel was supposed to meet Martinez on the 6th of November, but instead of seeing Martinez at their meeting point, he saw a white man who asked him if he was indeed Philip Medel. Medel, seemingly perplexed by the presence of this white man and the absence of Mike Martinez, said, "Yes, I am Philip Medel." And he asked where Martinez was. The white man said that they were going to meet him someplace else, and so they went off together. According to Medel's sworn statement, after this weird introductory meeting, the two of them drove by a restaurant in EDSA on the way to another location. Now, this restaurant was only pointed as something significant because after the men arrived at this other location to apparently look for another person, the pair of them drove back to that restaurant to have dinner. Mike Martinez was also supposed to show up at that restaurant, but he never did. Medel stated in his sworn statement that in the end it was only him and this white man who reiterated to him that Medel was to observe and intimidate the wife of a Chinese man. Medel, in his sworn statement, referred to this white man as Rad, R-A-D, and we would later find out that he was referring to Rod Strunk, Nida's husband. According to Medel, both him and Rod left the restaurant around 10 o'clock in the evening and they went to the 6th floor of the Atlanta Center. They apparently parked next to a green car and waited until midnight. And yes, the car that they parked next to was Nida's Nissan Sentra. Medel was then told by Rod, apparently, that he was leaving, but Medel must wait in the back seat of the green car. So Rod unlocked the car and let Medel into the Nissan Sentra. Medel sat there and spent most of his time waiting and texting friends. He eventually fell asleep. Medel then stated that he was awoken around 1 a.m. by lights from a car pulling into the adjacent space. He saw Rod and 2 other women get out of Rod's car. Medel then observed how Rod pushed one of the women, who was wearing a striped blouse and dark-colored trousers, into the back seat of the Nissan Sentra. So now Medel was beside this woman in the striped blouse. The scene here, as recounted by Medel, sounded very chaotic. Rod and the other woman then started kicking and striking the woman in the striped blouse. Medel joined in and stabbed the woman with his knife because he was ordered to do so. Medel specified that he stabbed her on the left side of her body and neck. Medel then said that he, Rod, and the other unidentified woman then left the parking lot around 2 in the morning. Medel said that he went home and hid his knife under his kitchen sink. The following day, he said he was shocked to find out that the person he apparently helped killing was indeed Nida Blanca. So, what I have recounted to you just now were the details within Medel's first sworn statement. A mere day after he signed his first statement, another sworn statement emerged in which he admitted that he knew from the very beginning that he was hired to intimidate Nida Blanca into surrendering a disputed legal document believed to be the legal rights to a property. Medel also claimed that he was offered around $3,922 with $980 down payment to kill Blanca. Medel, in his second sworn statement, specified that Strunk and 2 mannish-looking women assisted him in coercing Blanca to submit some documents that she should have signed. These were the legal rights to the property that I have just mentioned. When the actress could not do so or would not do so, Medel said he was ordered to stab her. So in this account, it looks like there were 4 people involved in the killing instead of 3, as specified in Medel's first sworn statement. These conflicting statements would later lead to big problems, so make sure you put a pin on this. Whether it was a paid job to intimidate the wife of some elusive Chinese man or Nida Blanca specifically, Medel's confession shook the public. Remember that woman who Medel saw with Strunk, or at least one of the women, according to his second sworn statement? She was identified as Ding Tantoco. Both Rod Strunk and Ding Tantoco denied any involvement in the killing of Nida Blanca. Tantoko, according to the Prime Crime blog, was put through a lie detector test and apparently passed, so they let her go. A quick word on lie detector tests or polygraph tests, and I do hope you take this to heart because pop culture really managed to influence our views and opinions on polygraph testing. Most psychologists agree that there is little evidence that polygraph tests can accurately detect lies. In an article from the American Psychological Association, a psychologist argues that, and I quote, the idea that we can detect a person's veracity by monitoring psychophysiological changes is more myth than reality. Even the term lie detector, used to refer to polygraph testing, is a misnomer. So-called lie detection involves inferring deception through analysis of physiological responses to a structured but unstandardized series of questions. End of quote. The article goes on to say that, and I quote, the accuracy, i.e., validity of polygraph testing has long been controversial. An underlying problem is theoretical. There is no evidence that any pattern of physiological reactions is unique to deception. An honest person may be nervous when answering truthfully, and a dishonest person may be non-anxious. End of quote. So, in a way, what I'm telling you is I need you to be a bit more skeptical when people tell you that their polygraph testing was all right or positive. It does not necessarily mean they have been honest about whatever it is that they've been asked. It just means they were calm enough to pass the test. So take such details in true crime stories with a grain of salt. Now, as to the Nida Blanca killing, I think that knowing what polygraph testing is all about, Ding Tantoko should not have been released that easily. But let's go back to Philip Medel now. Having dragged Rod Strunk's name into Nida's killing, Medel had made himself at that very moment a very important witness as well as a suspect, so much so that Rod Strunk was considered an official suspect the very next day on the 19th of November 2001. But this significant development in the investigation would not last that long. 5 days after Medel surrendered to the PNP, he retracted his statements in open court in what looked like a televised preliminary hearing on the 23rd of November 2001. To the shock of the nation, Medel claimed that he was tortured and forced to make a statement under duress. Those who will remember the footage will remember that Medel raised his hands, shouted an apology to Strunk, and said, "I don't know Mr. Strunk. Kill me now. Kill me now. I don't know him. I am sorry. I was tortured. Look at my arms." It was very dramatic. Medel then showed his wrists to the public. He could not be stopped after that initial outburst. He would shout, "I'm a victim of a political struggle." But he also did not elaborate on what this really meant. He then could be seen slumped to the floor. He was inconsolable and would not calm down. Later on, Medel's lawyer said that his client had been receiving death threats whilst still in police custody. When asked by journalists, Medel would later explain that, and I quote, "I was blindfolded for 3 days. My genitals were electrocuted. They placed a plastic bag on my head, which they filled with water. When they arrested me, they took specimens from my hair and fingernails. They asked for a kitchen knife and a shirt. Would you believe that I would keep the knife in my kitchen after the murder?" End of quote. In his many short interactions with journalists after his initial outbursts, he claimed that evidence of his alleged participation in Nida's murder was planted by the police. So, where did this leave the investigation? After this truly embarrassing public, well, as the young kids would say, epic fail, the justice officials suspended the preliminary investigation. Medell was transferred to the custody of the NBI, perhaps to reassure the judiciary and the public that if the claims of torture were true, Medell should at least be kept safe at a different police agency. Some reports have indicated that Medell's family had been threatened and even taken hostage when this was all happening. Meanwhile, Strong's lawyers demanded from the NBI that any accusations made against Strong must be dropped. There was also a threat to file a counter affidavit to clear Strong's name. As for Strong himself, he expressed disbelief, but also relief that Medell behaved the way he did. He felt this was a vindication for him. As for the PNP, they had some explaining to do. They had Medell medically examined, and the chief medical examiner concluded that Medell did not show any signs of torture, and the only injuries he could see were the results of being handcuffed, so essentially handcuff marks. The investigation, which looked like it was progressing so well before Medell's breakdown, was relegated back to square one. On the 30th of November 2001, reports surfaced that Medell's charges were dropped the day before on the 29th of November. In a resolution, Chief State Prosecutor Jovencito Zuno ordered not only the dropping of charges against Medell, but he also ordered the Police Criminal Investigation and Detection Group to come up with new evidence to pin down Medell and other suspects in Nida's murder. Make no mistake, though, Medell nevertheless remained a suspect despite his charges being dropped. I guess the reasoning behind this was even though the police felt they did not have sufficient evidence at that point, they still were not convinced of Medell's innocence. Nevertheless, the police had to look for more evidence against him, but they also needed to pursue other lines of inquiries, making sure that they also looked at other potential suspects. I think it goes without saying at this point in the investigation that Medell's retraction had eroded the credibility of the police significantly. But doubts were also cast on Medell's credibility itself and also his state of mind. The truth is, Medell was not just some random guy off the street that was allegedly hired by Strunk and this still mysterious Mike Martinez out of nowhere. Medell was actually a former police and military civilian agent who worked for 2 years as a mercenary in Angola in Africa during the mid-90s. I am telling you this because from my research, it looked like people were trying to make sense of Medell's behavior given this former life that he had. Was he just good at lying about killing because of his past experiences, or was he really tortured and thus suffered a mental breakdown? I guess the NBI wanted to know these things as well because after the 23rd of November, on top of the physical examination that Medell had to go through in order to prove or disprove torture, the NBI insisted that he should also undergo a psychiatric test. I tried to find any reports that would tell me what the results of this psychiatric tests were, but I could not find any. I also tried to find any reports that would give me any information as to what happened to the investigation into Medell's torture allegations, but those reports were very obviously missing from the internet. So I'm thinking that like in a lot of cases where there is an allegation of torture or police misconduct, Medel's allegations were merely swept under the rug and never mentioned again. So we have to continue with our story. Now, despite Medel's very public retraction, Rod Strunk was still pulled in by the PNP for questioning on the 13th of December 2001. He was questioned for 13 hours and he ended up submitting a 12-page sworn statement, essentially again denying any involvement in Nida's killing. The reason why the PNP was still hell-bent on pulling in Strunk despite Medel's retraction was that they considered Medel's initial confession still valid because his retraction was apparently not made under oath. A very odd technicality, if you ask me. Also, the PNP firmly still believed that Medel had to be involved because before he surrendered, he sort of sent out feelers out there to test the temperatures of what he could be expecting should he surrender. Very odd, I know, but let me explain. There were many sworn statements that were gathered during the course of the Nida Blanca investigation. So Medel's sworn statement was not the only one and by no means the first one that the police were able to get. Some of these earlier sworn statements from other witnesses were ultimately used as a basis to pin Medel and Strunk on the charges of murder. One of the people who had given a sworn statement was someone called Leonilo Gonzaga, who worked as a security officer for an agency. The president of this agency was someone called Rolly Quintanar. Now, pay close attention because things could get confusing now. Rolly Quintanar was a nephew of a general called Galileo Quintanar. Now, Leonilo stated that he first met Philip Medel at the general's home, and after striking a friendship with him, they ended up living together in an apartment. It was therefore implied in his statement that the general knew Medel, or at the very least had met him once before. Leonilo continued and said that on the 10th of November 2001, a mere 3 days after Nida was found dead at the Atlanta Center, Medel admitted the murder to him and expressed how he wanted to surrender to the authorities. Leonilo, not exactly knowing what he should be doing with this information, ended up telling his boss, Rolly Quintanar, and it was Quintanar who actually facilitated Medel's surrender. Statements made by Gonzaga and Quintanar also claimed that Medel communicated with Rod Strunk before the murder, implying that the first sworn statement made by Medel was in part untrue because in that one, as you can remember, Medel said that he met Strunk for the very first time on the 6th of November 2001. This would have been all still fine and could serve as corroborative evidence to what Medel confessed to in both his statements, but there was one tiny problem. General Galileo Quintanar denied vehemently that he knew Medel and Strunk at all. This ended up casting a very big shadow on all these statements from Leonilo Gonzaga, Rolly Quintanar, and even Medel himself. You would think that at this point, the PNP should have just distanced themselves from Medel's confession altogether, but they held on to it despite all these inconsistencies. This is worrying as it feels like they may have slowly stopped looking at other potential suspects and remained focused on Medel and Strunk. For some, this could have been totally the right thing to do, but I would imagine that good police work involved eliminating other possibilities so that you are left with the most likely one, your murderer or murderers. And then there was this issue about the mysterious Mike Martinez. At this point in the investigation, the police still did not tell the public a lot about what they knew about Mike Martinez, but word got out around this time that he was apparently abducted by still unidentified men a day before Medel's retraction. Further questions about Mike Martinez were overshadowed by what happened in January 2002. In a surprising turn of events, Strunk left for the United States to take care of his ailing mother despite being on the Bureau of Immigration watch list prior to his departure. He was still able to leave the country and there was no court order issued against his departure. Someone forgot to mention here that a court order cannot be made without someone actually applying for one. This is Law 101. This means that despite Strunk apparently signaling to the authorities prior to his departure that he was going to leave the country, absolutely no one from the government bothered to even attempt to stop this by filing some urgent motion or application with the court. This is completely baffling to me. And what is more baffling is that the police authorities proceeded and continued with their investigation as if nothing happened or as if Strunk leaving the Philippines did not pose a great problem to them. Now, whilst Strunk was in the United States, a few more details came out during the investigation, and this is what we need to look at right now. The Philippine National Police was confident that despite the retractions, denials, and inconsistencies, they could still prove that Strunk, at the very least, was at the crime scene. The first piece of evidence was a Swiss Army knife, which was the alleged murder weapon or one of the murder weapons. They found a receipt linking the knife to Strunk, who they said bought the knife at Robinson's Galleria Mall in Mandaluyong 2 days before Nida's death. The second piece of evidence was an umbrella. They said that Strunk always kept this particular umbrella in his car. When Nida was found in her car, they also found this umbrella. This is where it gets a little bit more interesting. Now, remember that 12-page sworn statement that the police got out of Strunk after he was interrogated for 13 hours? In that statement, he did admit that he was at the crime scene on the morning of the murder, but only to take a look inside Nida's car. He denied opening the car. And this raised so many questions as to the crime scene integrity and the crime scene preservation. Although not indicated in any of the reports that I have found researching this episode, I would imagine that Strunk's admission as to being at the crime scene hours before the police were called in by the security guard incriminated him in some way. I can somehow understand why the police thought they could still have a strong case against Strunk even without Medel's initial statements. It is very odd for a husband to see his dead wife in a car and not report this himself or maybe be distressed about it. It's truly odd. Now, going back to the umbrella. A friend of Nida's claimed that when Nida visited her 2 nights before the murder, she did not see the umbrella in Nida's car, therefore implying that the umbrella was left in Nida's car sometime between this night with her friend and the time she was found dead. With this statement, it was also implied that whoever killed Nida will have left the umbrella in her car. Now, the PNP and also the NBI were steadfast in their belief that Strunk was most definitely involved in the murder because they had managed to confirm a possible motive. For them, Nida was killed because of greed, Rod Strunk's greed. They claimed that the marriage between the couple had essentially been dead at this point, and that Strunk had stopped caring for his wife's whereabouts and well being. Furthermore, the NBI claimed that Strunk may have been possibly disinherited, which could be a contentious position to be in, especially when the assets involved are properties worth 85 million pesos. Investigators claimed that Nida had prepared a last will and testament, making her only daughter, Kate Torres, her sole heir. The NBI also claimed that the couple were as good as separated at this point, but their marriage had not yet been annulled. If Nida had not died and an annulment had been finalized, Strong could possibly have been left with nothing. However, now that Nida was gone, Strong was by law entitled to a portion of Nida's wealth despite the stipulations in her will. Do you remember Medel's second sworn statement when he said Rod and Nida were arguing about Nida not wanting to surrender a legal document? Medel, in his statement or statements, understood that the document was a property-related document, but reports from 2002 claimed that the NBI thought the couple argued over Nida's will. Whatever the legal document was that the couple argued about, that eventually ended in Nida being murdered, we can safely assume that what the investigators were getting at was that the couple argued about wealth and money, specifically Nida's wealth and Strong's perception of what he deserved out of it. So, as the year 2002 progressed, the investigation also proceeded as normal, whilst Strunk was still out of the country. By July 2002, the NBI charged 3 people as principal suspects and 3 as accessories to the crime. Specifically, Strunk was charged in his absence with parricide, which is essentially a fancy word for the killing of a parent or other near relative. Medel was charged with murder, together with a Jane Doe, a John Doe, and other does, which still perplexes me. Were the NBI and the Department of Justice not sure who the John and Jane Does were in this case, or were they concerned about revealing their identities? I have just never heard of a police authority announcing charges against people who are essentially unidentified. Apart from the already mentioned individuals, several other people were also charged for obstruction of justice, and it's not clear as to what they have done to be deserving of such charges. But we know their names, and they were mostly guards from the Atlanta Center. They were Ricky Alvarez, Roberto Cañete, and Diolito Molines. Of course, in a way, I commend the police agencies for cracking down on these major and also minor players, but it seems to me like they were going after the small fishes when they should be more concerned about their main suspect still being overseas. On the 12th of August 2002, the NBI requested the DOJ, or the Department of Justice, to amend the criminal charges against Rod Strunk, essentially charging him with murder instead of parricide. Now, I had to give myself a crash course on how Philippine law views parricide and murder, whether one was more serious than the other, and this is what I have found out. The main deciding element of parricide as a crime is the familial connection between the perpetrator and the victim. The motive behind the parricide could be intentional or negligent, but the box that needs to be ticked here is that the people involved are related. Now, if the parricide involves aggravating circumstances such as treachery, taking advantage of one's superior strength to kill the victim, or killing in exchange for money, or perhaps killing using poison with evident premeditation and with cruelty, it becomes a murder. So the charges were eventually changed, and it seems like the investigation just trudged along, and we do not really hear from the police agencies involved until November 2002, when the Department of Justice announced that they were terminating the preliminary investigation into Nida's murder. By the 14th of February 2003, the Department of Justice finally indicted Strunk officially as the mastermind of Nida's murder on the strength of Medel's confession. So at this point, Medel, Strunk, and at least one mysterious Jane Doe had all been charged with murder. All the guards who were charged with obstruction of justice were exonerated due to lack of evidence. 7 days later, on the 21st of February 2003, Judge Alex Quiros of the Pasig Regional Trial Court Branch 156 issued a warrant of arrest for Strunk. 3 days later, the chief state prosecutor ordered a justice panel department to finally start extradition proceedings for Strunk. By May 2003, Strunk was arrested by U.S. Marshals in the Eastern District of California. With the Philippine government gearing up for the extradition process, I can imagine how the police agencies may have felt like they were finally entering a new phase into the investigation, a more high-stakes one. After all, the chances of getting Strunk extradited were still 50-50. Now, before I go on with what happened for the rest of 2003, I do have to circle back at this point to all the statements and findings we have heard so far. When put together, some of them make sense and some do not. If Medel is to be believed in his initial statements, it looks to me that Nida, after leaving her office, may have been intercepted by Strunk, who was in his car. Did they go anywhere? Where was Nida left whilst Strunk was meeting with Medel, or when Elena saw Strunk in their home after her little search? Also, the blood trail evidence in the parking lot seems to indicate to me, after knowing what Medel had said, that when Nida arrived with Strunk and this other mysterious woman, they were standing far away enough from the car before Nida was struck and then dragged to the car. Medel did not seem to say this because, as we have already heard, he said Rod, Nida, and Jane Doe arrived. Rod and Nida then argued, and then Nida was assaulted, pushed into the backseat of her car, where she was assaulted some more, and then stabbed. Despite all these inconsistencies, the police remained steadfast in their belief that Strunk and Medel were the main perpetrators, and they stuck with this belief all throughout the investigation. Now, let's go back to the end of May 2003. By the end of May, a U.S. federal magistrate ruled that Rod Strunk must remain in California whilst awaiting his extradition hearing that would take place on July 28th. This magistrate considered Strunk to be a flight risk and stated that his actions suggested that he was capable of doing just about anything to avoid being sent back to the Philippines. A few days before the extradition hearing, the Department of Justice officially turned over a formal request to the Department of Foreign Affairs, who is usually responsible to pass such a request over to the United States in an extradition matter. The request contained all the material evidence needed for Strunk's extradition, except for a missing document in which Strunk apparently made a promise to return to the country. This document went missing around a month earlier and was never found. It is actually possible that this document never existed and it was something that the authorities perhaps fabricated to appease criticisms about allowing Strunk to leave the country. Even if this document really existed, I think that common sense should have dictated that a person accused of a murder with a possibility of ending up in a Filipino jail for the rest of his life will say just about anything to reassure people that he was coming back if it meant he can leave the country right now. The presence of this document or the mere mention of this document indicates to me that the Philippine authorities had plenty of time to mull things over and maybe decide that, hey, it's not a good idea to let this guy go. Let us file something with the court, perhaps, so we can stop our potential mastermind from leaving the country indefinitely. But no one did this. So, with all of these things going on, the extradition hearing pending in the States, and the absence of Strunk in the Philippines while the case is still being investigated, a trial was nevertheless scheduled, and it began on the 8th of July 2003. Meanwhile, in California, the extradition hearing was also gearing up. By November, a decision was finally handed down. The court denied the Department of Justice's extradition request, and the main reason was Medel's retraction. Now, let's go through the court's thought process little by little, but I promise it's not going to be a long bit within this episode. First of all, the court recognized that in extradition cases, the requesting country is not required to submit all of its evidence, but the evidence that has to be submitted should show, at the very least, probable cause that someone was involved in a crime. The court does not seek to see evidence that would be deemed sufficient to convict. In Strunk's case, the court in California firstly commented on the chaotic and unreliable nature of the evidence that the Philippine government did submit, describing it as a mishmash of declarations within declarations, some containing argument and some only facts. Some evidence exhibits looked like they were just scattered into the case file on their own or as a support for someone else's declaration. The court expressed its frustration for having to muddle through the evidence and determine what it could really rely on and what not. The court, as I said, heavily relied on Medel's retraction and also did not look favorably on something that I have not told you yet. In the extradition hearing, it was submitted that Medel insisted that his family be paid by the Philippine government authorities for the confession that he had made. The amount requested by Medel was 20,000 pesos, but the family apparently received only half of that. This again did not help Medel's credibility as a witness. The court specifically stated, and I quote, "There always seems to be a need to embellish what was initially said in order to make the case better. This fact is not necessarily detrimental, but importantly, the embellishments contain significant inconsistencies." End of quote. The inconsistencies that the court was referring to here were the ones in Medel's two sworn statements. The court specifically found it vexing that in the first statement, as I already mentioned in the first half of this episode, Medel said that he had never met Strunk before the 6th of November 2001. And in the second statement, he stated he in fact had met him before that date, and he was also given clear instructions to intimidate Nida Blanca. As I already indicated, the court in California ultimately decided to deny the extradition request by the Philippine government. And unfortunately for the Philippine government, a denied extradition request cannot be appealed. I wanted to double check this, so I looked for the extradition treaty between the US and the Philippines, which I have also linked in the sources list, as well as the court case that I've already mentioned. So this is for the law geeks out there. The rather short document does not necessarily say anything about appeals, but as it turns out, extradition law in the US in general does not provide for appeals as per the US Department of Justice Justice Manual. A link to this is also in the sources list. For Strunk, things seemed to be looking up since he could not be forced to go back to the Philippines anymore. You would think he'd stay quiet, but he managed to make himself heard in a lot of interviews following the extradition decision, and he said over and over again that he was innocent. He said that he lost all of his possessions because of Nida's death. He called the allegations over the inheritance absurd. Rod Strunk also asked the Court of Appeals in the Philippines to consider quashing the murder charges against him, but he was denied. He invited the court to reconsider this in September 2004, but the court denied the motion yet again. The next year, in 2005, Strunk attempted yet again to clear his name and, through his lawyers, filed a petition asking the Supreme Court of the Philippines to stop the serving of his arrest warrant. He also asked the Supreme Court to throw out the case against him completely. I could not find a document that would indicate what the Supreme Court's decision was, but since the trial went ahead still after this, I am assuming the petition was also denied. 2005 was also the year when the public was introduced to a trial witness called Andrada Dalandas. Dalandas was someone who was at the Atlanta Center around the time of the murder. According to her, she saw Medel and a quote-unquote foreigner on the 7th of November 2001 on the 6th floor of the Atlanta Center in Greenhills, San Juan. She said that Medel was carrying a limp body and that he was tapped on the shoulder by this foreigner, who she later confirmed was Rod Strunk. Dalandas further testified that she was waiting for her friend at the building's parking lot when she saw Medel and two other men. She said she hid under the stairs and left the building with her friend, who arrived a few minutes later. She only realized the next day after watching the news that Nida Blanca had died, and she also later recognized Strunk from the news footage following Nida's death. The other man she described was thought to be the mysterious Mike Martinez, who was still missing at that point. I am not sure what the prosecution thought when they allowed Dalandas on the stand. Whilst I can understand that Dalandas put Medel and Strunk at the crime scene, everything else seems to contradict Medel's statements, which I thought was the core of the prosecution's case. I'm confused about Dalandas' statement about seeing a limp body carried by Medel on the 7th of November and not the 6th. I am also not sure about her statement about seeing two other men with Medel. According to Medel, the only men who were at the crime scene were himself and Strunk. Maybe the prosecution thought that despite the inconsistencies, after all, Medel's credibility was in question anyway, the only thing they needed to prove to the court was that Strunk and Medel have always been involved despite their denial. Now let me take you into a quick excursion into the Mike Martinez situation. By 2006, Martinez's family moved into action and wanted to finally know the fate of their loved one. They filed a petition with the Supreme Court and against the PNP and other police agencies, asking them to produce Martinez. They believed they had Martinez. They believed that Martinez was abducted and was being held by the government for some sinister reason. The Supreme Court was not convinced. It argued that there was no incentive for the government or the police agencies to hide Martinez, as he could be the key to the investigation. The court argued furthermore that abducting and or hurting Martinez would be detrimental to the PNP and the NBI's investigation. Please note that this was not the first time the Martinez family had tried to move against the government authorities and police agencies. They first tried to file a habeas corpus case against the Department of Justice in 2002, demanding from them that they produce Martinez. However, this case fizzled out amongst the furor that Medel and his retraction created. So the Martinez mystery perseveres to this very day. By November 2006, the Philippine government vowed to speed up the case and expressed plans to make another bid for Strong's extradition. I could not find any records of another extradition application, so I'm not sure if this had been pursued at all and if maybe the information was kept from the public. What I do know is that after November 2006, the next big news in the media was that Rod Strunk had died by suicide. On the 11th of July 2007, Rod Strunk was reported to have fallen 20 feet to his death from a hotel balcony in Tracy, California. With Strunk's death, Medel was the only other principal suspect left on trial. The hearing went on whilst Medel was in custody. However, on the 7th of April 2010, Medel passed away after having complained of breathing difficulties days before. The internal medicine resident at Pasig General Hospital stated that Medel died due to blood infection caused by pneumonia. He was only 62 years old. With both Medel and Strunk gone, the trial was essentially discontinued after never having left the evidentiary stage. In Philippine law, once an accused dies, the criminal liability is considered extinguished. The case, therefore, for all intents and purposes, remains unsolved, and Nida never got the justice she so deserved. Before I end this episode, I do have to wonder out loud about a few loose strings in this case. For example, whatever happened to the DNA samples taken from underneath Nida's fingernails? Were those ever tested against DNA samples from Medel or Strunk? Who were the John and Jane Does who were initially charged with Medel and Strunk? Did the police ever question the family's lawyer about the will and perhaps the couple's property issues? I know that in at least one news article it was reported that Rod Strunk had an affair with another woman. Was that ever investigated? Was she investigated? And lastly, where is Mike Martinez? And did he probably know a bit more than the police agencies told us? Ultimately, this case met a very unnecessarily sad end. Kate Torres, Nida's daughter, remained vocal in her pursuit for justice for her mother. To this day, Nida's death is still considered a mystery and has fascinated a lot of us, judging by the many times this case has been covered by YouTubers, bloggers, and podcasters. I hope that as content creators in our own little way, we will keep the conversation going about the many things about this case that should have been done properly but were not, such as the investigation that seemed to focus too much on certain suspects instead of casting a wider net to look for other potential suspects, or the botched extradition application. Despite the lack of earthly justice, I do hope that Nida Blanca is resting in peace, and I hope that we will always remember her life and the contributions she had made to the Filipino performing arts. Lagim fam, thank you so much for sticking by me for this long and truly devastating story. And also, I want to thank you for helping this little podcast of mine reach 20,000 downloads. This is a huge deal and would not have been possible without your support. So thank you, daghang salamat, maraming salamat again. As always, make sure to follow us on all social media platforms, especially on Instagram, where you can get all your Lagim updates and some extra true crime content. If you want to support this podcast, make sure to subscribe to Lagim's Patreon page. It has only one tier for now, which allows you early access to episodes and access to bonus episodes in the future. Alternatively, you can also make a one-off gift through Buy Me Coffee. Links to Lagim's Patreon and Buy Me Coffee pages are in Lagim's Instagram bio, so make sure to check out our bio over at Instagram. Lastly, please do not forget to rate and comment about Lagim on Apple Podcasts. It truly helps give this little podcast a bit of exposure to others who may have not heard about Lagim yet. Now, on to my podcast recommendation of the week. My podcast recommendation of the week is TGIC, or Teen Girls Investigate Crime. I love these pair of teenage badass girls who are doing a great job at featuring interesting true crime stories every week. Here is their trailer.
Hi, fellow true crime fans. Let us introduce ourselves. We are Teen Girls Investigate Crime Podcast, also known as TGIC. I'm your host and editor, Izzy.
And I'm your other host and social media manager, Jillian.
We create and publish episodes once a week. We cover all kinds of true crime cases.
Infamous to the less talked about, murders to missing persons, solved to unsolved, you are sure to fall down the rabbit hole that is true crime. Follow us on Instagram at tgic.podcast and listen to our podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts.
Thank you again for tuning into episode 13 and make sure you come back for episode 14 in 2 weeks. Maraming salamat at mabuhay.